Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in a flashbang grenade, drag you out in handcuffs, point a gun at your wife's head, all because they actually got the wrong house. Now, here's the kicker. When you try to hold them accountable and the government accountable for their mistake, they claim that they cannot be sued and that they had the discretion to potentially plan this raid and get it wrong. This exact situation went all the way to the Supreme Court, and recently the Supreme Court handed down a 9-0 unanimous decision that could have big implications for not just this family, but everyone in the nation. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe to the channel. That helps the channel to grow, and also double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed you. A lot of people think that they're still subscribed, but unfortunately YouTube unsubscribes you without you knowing. So just double check that. Thank you so much for all of your support. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing some cases that deal with law enforcement mistakes, wrongful raids, excessive force, and a recent 9-0 unanimous decision issued by the Supreme Court, which all gun owners should actually be aware of. Now, the primary case that we're going to be talking about is called U.S. versus Martin, or Martin versus United States, and it comes out of a suburban Atlanta area where essentially back in 2017, the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid, but the only problem was that they got the wrong home. The family inside of that house sued the federal government, sued the FBI under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The question the court had to address was, does the federal government get to walk away from liability, or can an ordinary citizen try to hold the federal agency accountable when they commit this type of mistake? Now, these situations are not just simply one-offs. In fact, there are similar cases right now pending in multiple district courts and circuit courts. In fact, one of them was recently ruled on by the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, in that case called Arias versus Herzon, DEA agents were sued under Bivens claims. Now, that deals with a different type of legal mechanism than what we're talking about here in the Martin case, but they were sued because the DEA agents actually raided a man's home, arrested him, and even potentially deployed excessive force against him. That's one of the main arguments, that they engaged in excessive force, but the fact was that they simply got the wrong guy. That challenge aims to hold the individual officers actually accountable under the Bivens claims, whereas Martin, like I said, deals with trying to hold the federal agency and the federal government at large accountable for their agents' wrongful acts. And the Martin case really primarily deals with negligent tort actions under the FTCA, where the Arias case deals with trying to hold the individual agents accountable under some sort of Bivens claims. Now, here's what happened in the Martin case that was ruled on by the Supreme Court. FBI agent Lawrence Guerrera was tasked with leading a pre-dawn raid against a home where suspected gang members were believed to be hiding and living at. And the target address was a specific address. So the officer there decided, instead of just going there directly, I don't know if they scouted it beforehand, but what he did decide to do was put the address into his personal GPS. I believe it was his own phone. Now, his GPS routed him to a completely different home where the individuals here, Katrina Martin, lived with her boyfriend at the time, and also their 7-year-old son. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated some flashbang grenades, pulled out Katrina Martin, put her in handcuffs, held her at gunpoint, also pulled the boyfriend out of the home. I believe he was hiding in the closet at the time. I don't know why, but they pulled him out, and they also pulled the 7-year-old boy out as well. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home, and while performing that search, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and when he looked at the address on that mail, he noticed that it was a completely different home, and they kind of had that huge oh crap moment, we raided the wrong home. Now, in response to this wrongful raid, the family sued the federal government under the FTCA, which is a law that allows ordinary people to sue the federal government and these types of agencies for certain wrongful acts that are performed by the federal employees here, which would be the FBI agents. Normally, the federal government and these individual agents are shielded from these types of lawsuits, but the FTCA is one of those situations where the government has agreed to allow individuals to bring these types of negligent tort actions against them. But the FTCA comes with a long list of exceptions where you cannot actually sue them. Now, one of those exceptions that was at issue in this case is called the discretionary function exception. That exception shields the federal government when the wrongful act stems from an official making a discretionary decision, meaning that a decision that involves judgment, choice, or policy considerations. So in this case, the family tried to hold the FBI responsible for the agent's wrongful actions under the FTCA, but the federal government claimed that they fell under these types of exceptions in the FTCA. Primarily, one of the ones was the discretionary function. They claimed that the use of the personal GPS by that officer was a discretionary function, and therefore the lawsuit should fail. When the family filed their lawsuit in the district court, the government moved to dismiss the case, arguing that both the intentional tort and discretionary function exceptions in the FTCA barred this type of lawsuit. The district court ultimately sided with the FBI, and then the case was appealed to the 11th Circuit on review, and once again they ruled in favor of the federal government and the FBI. This case was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on review the court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling, and they ruled in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's ruling and sent the case back down for re-review. The Supreme Court held first that the law enforcement proviso only modifies the intentional tort exception. It does not override all the exceptions in the FTCA. Now, that's because what happened is the FBI was trying to argue that that proviso applied to all of the FTCA, but the Supreme Court said no, it only applied to that one section. Now, the second thing that the court did is they vacated and remanded the case to the 11th Circuit for new briefs and new arguments on whether the discretionary function exception in the FTCA bars the Martins' negligent and intentional tort claims that they brought against the FBI. Recently, the DOJ was able to get an extension on this case and what they needed to file at the 11th Circuit, and really that was because they argued the government shutdown prevents them from doing that, but eventually they're going to have to file those briefs in light of what the Supreme Court just said. Now, the other side of the coin that I mentioned is a case that just came out of the First Circuit, and that's in the Arias case, and that deals with a wrongful arrest by the DEA and excessive force that potentially happened in that case, and that was ruled in favor of the individual and remanded to the district court for further factual developments. The Arias case is a different legal vehicle where instead of going after the government or the agency civilly at large, going after the federal government, you try to hold the individual officers accountable for their wrongful actions civilly, bring constitutional claims against the individual, but there are narrow rules in which you can do that. But here in this Arias case, the court said that that case could move forward. And so this case was sent back down to the lower court for further factual developments and further, information to see if the individual officers could be held accountable for their wrongful arrest and what they did in their actions, potentially some excessive force situations that played out in that case. Both of these cases are now being cited in more and more lawsuits, which are dealing with law enforcement wrongful acts, excessive force cases, and things like that dealing with the Fourth Amendment. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with gun owners? Now, here's why this is so critical and important. Wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrests, and excessive force situations actually impact a lot of law-abiding gun owners. We have a lot of high-profile cases that we've heard about in the news where individuals are lawful gun owners. They're raided by the ATF, FBI, DEA, or local and state, agencies. And, a lot of things go wrong and potentially someone is hurt really bad, or maybe even there are deadly consequences. If the federal government can hide behind discretion under the FTCA every single time that they mess up, well, there's no accountability. And the Supreme Court's ruling in Martin kind of narrows the government's ability to avoid these types of lawsuits by claiming broad immunity. These cases reinforce that the federal government and potentially an individual officer can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their power. So these are two critical cases that are currently moving forward. One of them is moving forward at the 11th Circuit level. One of them was ruled on by the First Circuit and remanded back down to the district court. They deal with similar issues, but they're two different legal mechanisms for trying to hold officers accountable. So that's what recently happened in another significant case that was reviewed by the Supreme Court. Like I said, it was a 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court. And that's also what happened in the First Circuit in a similar case, but dealing with a different legal mechanism. It's now going to be interesting to see how these lower courts deal with these cases and how they play out now and what the federal government argues in these cases and what the individual officers argue in this case. So as we get more information, as it develops, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm and tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of information. Also, you can check out one of these two videos here on the screen where the YouTube algorithm thinks that you will find it helpful. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.